dust swirled around Thomas Mackenzie's weathered boots as he stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the horizon with tired eyes. The sun was setting over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of better times. His cattle ranch, once the pride of Copper Creek County, now felt more like a burden he could barely carry. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 20 years building his dream from nothing. When he first arrived in Texas with only a horse and $50 to his name, he never imagined he would own 3,000 acres of prime grazing land. But dreams had a way of turning into nightmares when you weren't careful. The trouble started 3 months ago when his ranch hands began disappearing one by one. First it was Miguel, his most trusted cowboy who simply vanished during a routine cattle drive. Then came the mysterious deaths of his livestock. Dozens of his prized longhorn cattle were found dead in the fields, their bodies showing signs of poison. The local sheriff, a lazy man named Bill Crawford, claimed it was probably disease or bad water, but Thomas knew better. Someone was trying to destroy him, and he had a pretty good idea who it was. Victor Blackwood owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and he had been trying to buy Thomas's land for years. Every offer was refused, and every refusal made Blackwood angrier. The man had connections everywhere, with the bank, the railroad company, and even some of the less honest lawmen in the territory. Thomas had heard whispers in town about Blackwood's methods of persuasion, and none of them were pleasant. As Thomas walked back into his house, the silence hit him like a physical blow. The place felt empty and cold, despite the warm evening air. His wife Sarah had died 2 years ago from fever, leaving him alone to run the ranch and raise their 10-year-old daughter, Emma. But even Emma wasn't here anymore. She was staying with Sarah's sister in San Antonio, supposedly for her education, but really because Thomas was afraid for her safety. The kitchen table was covered with unpaid bills and legal documents. The bank was demanding payment on loans that Thomas had taken out to expand his operation. Without his missing cattle and with his remaining workers too scared to stay, he was facing bankruptcy. Worse than that, he was facing the very real possibility of losing everything he had worked for. Thomas poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down heavily in his chair. The liquid burned his throat, but it helped calm his nerves. He had to think of a solution, and he had to think fast. Blackwood wasn't going to stop his attacks, and the law wasn't going to help. Thomas was on his own, just like he had been when he first came to Texas all those years ago. That's when he remembered the conversation he had overheard at Murphy's saloon last week. 3 men had been talking about a peculiar situation in the nearby town of Willowbrook. Apparently, there were 3 women there who needed help, and they were willing to work for anyone who could provide them with protection and a place to stay. The men had laughed about it, calling it strange and probably dangerous, but Thomas hadn't been laughing. The women were sisters, according to the gossip. Their names were Catherine, Mary, and Elizabeth Donovan, and they had arrived in Willowbrook 3 weeks ago on the afternoon stagecoach. Nobody knew exactly where they had come from or why they were traveling alone, but that wasn't unusual in a territory where people often had reasons to leave their past behind. What made their situation interesting was that they weren't looking for husbands, which was the usual reason single women came to Texas. Instead, they had approached several business owners in Willowbrook with an unusual proposition. They offered to work as housekeepers, cooks, and general laborers in exchange for room, board, and protection from whoever might be following them. Thomas had dismissed the story at first, thinking it was probably just saloon gossip mixed with wishful thinking. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense for his situation. He needed people he could trust to help run his ranch, people who wouldn't be scared off by Blackwood's threats or disappear in the middle of the night. If these women were running from something themselves, they might be desperate enough to stay and fight. The next morning, Thomas saddled his horse and rode the 15 miles to Willowbrook. The town was smaller than Copper Creek, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a dusty main street. The saloon, general store, and hotel looked like they had seen better days, but the place had an honest, hard-working atmosphere that Thomas appreciated. He found the 3 women at the hotel sitting in the lobby and reading books. Thomas had expected them to look rough and desperate, like most people running from trouble, but he was surprised by what he saw. Catherine, the oldest, appeared to be in her late 20s with dark hair and intelligent green eyes. Mary looked to be about 25, with auburn hair and a determined expression. Elizabeth, the youngest, couldn't have been more than 22, with blonde hair and a sweet face that reminded Thomas of his late wife. All three women were dressed simply but cleanly, and they carried themselves with a dignity that impressed Thomas. When he approached them and introduced himself, they listened politely as he explained his situation and his proposal. "Mr. Mackenzie," Catherine said after he finished speaking, "we appreciate your offer, but we should be honest about our circumstances. We're not just looking for work. We're running from someone who wants to harm us, and associating with us might put you in danger." Thomas almost smiled at that. "Ma'am, I'm already in plenty of danger. The question is whether you're willing to face it alongside me in exchange for a place to call home." Mary leaned forward in her chair. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to help me save my ranch," Thomas replied. "I need people I can trust to help with the cooking, cleaning, and general work around the place. But I'll be honest, you might also need to help defend it. The man who's trying to destroy me isn't going to stop just because I have more people working for me." Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. "Are you asking us to marry you, Mr. Dye?" "Mackenzie?" "No, ma'am," Thomas said quickly. "I'm offering you employment and protection in exchange for your help. Nothing more, nothing less. You'll have your own quarters, and your privacy will be respected. I'm a widower with a daughter, and I need help keeping my ranch running, not complications in my personal life." The three sisters exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that siblings sometimes share. Finally, Catherine nodded. "We need to discuss this privately," she said. "Can you give us an hour to talk it over?" Thomas agreed and went to the saloon to wait. As he sat with a beer and listened to the conversations around him, he wondered if he was making a mistake. Taking in three mysterious women who were running from trouble might solve some of his problems, but it could just as easily create new ones. When the hour was up, Thomas returned to the hotel to find the sisters waiting for him with their bags packed. "We've decided to accept your offer, Mr. Breyer," Mackenzie, Catherine announced. "But we have some conditions of our own." "I'm listening," Thomas said. "First, we want to know what we're really facing," Mary said. "You mentioned someone trying to destroy you. We need details if we're going to help. Second," Elizabeth added, "we need to be able to defend ourselves. Do you have weapons at your ranch, and are you willing to teach us how to use them?" Thomas was impressed by their directness. "Fair enough. The man trying to destroy me is named Victor Blackwood. He owns the biggest ranch in the territory and wants my land. He's been poisoning my cattle, scaring off my workers, and probably bribing local officials to make my life difficult. As for weapons, I have rifles and pistols, and yes, I'll teach you to use them if you're serious about staying." "We're serious," Catherine said firmly. "We've learned that running from trouble doesn't make it go away. Sometimes you have to stand and fight." The wagon ride back to Thomas's ranch took most of the afternoon. During the journey, the women shared more details about their situation. They had grown up on a farm in Missouri, where they had learned to work hard and take care of themselves. Their parents had died in a cholera outbreak 2 years ago, leaving them to manage the farm alone. The trouble started when a local businessman named Jerome Walsh decided he wanted their land for a railroad development. When the sisters refused to sell, Walsh began making their lives increasingly difficult. He had influence with the local sheriff and judge, and he used that influence to create legal problems for the sisters. When Walsh's son started making unwelcome advances toward Elizabeth and became violent when she refused him, the sisters knew they had to leave. "We sold what we could and left Missouri in the middle of the night," Mary explained. "We've been traveling for weeks, trying to find a place where Walsh's influence can't reach us." Thomas listened to their story with growing respect for their courage and determination. These weren't helpless women looking for someone to take care of them. They were survivors who had already proven they could handle adversity. As the sun began to set, Thomas's ranch came into view. The house was a solid 2-story structure made of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that faced the sunset. The barn and other outbuildings were well maintained, and the pastures stretched out toward the horizon where Thomas's remaining cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly, and Thomas felt a surge of pride despite his current troubles. That night, after the women had settled into their rooms and shared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Thomas sat on his porch and watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he had found the help he needed to save everything he had worked for. But in the distance, barely visible in the darkness, a rider sat watching the ranch house. Victor Blackwood had learned about Thomas's new employees, and he wasn't pleased. The game was about to become much more dangerous for everyone involved. The rooster's crow pierced the morning air at dawn, and Thomas was already awake, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom. Sleep had been difficult since the arrival of the Donovan sisters 3 days ago, not because of any problems they had caused, but because everything was changing so rapidly. Catherine had proven herself to be an excellent organizer, taking charge of the household duties with the efficiency of someone who had run her own farm. Mary had a natural talent with the livestock, and the remaining cattle seemed calmer when she was around. Elizabeth, despite her delicate appearance, turned out to be fearless when it came to hard physical work. She had spent yesterday afternoon helping Thomas repair the damaged sections of fence around the north pasture. But Thomas knew that Blackwood wouldn't ignore these developments for long. The man had spies everywhere, and news traveled fast in a territory where gossip was often the only entertainment available. As Thomas dressed and prepared to start the day's work, he heard voices from the kitchen downstairs. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted up through the floorboards, reminding him of the mornings when Sarah was still alive. For a moment, the memory brought both comfort and pain. When Thomas entered the kitchen, he found the 3 sisters already busy with breakfast preparations. Catherine was frying eggs in the large iron skillet, while Mary was setting the table, and Elizabeth was pulling a tray of fresh biscuits from the oven. "Good morning, Mr. Mackenzie," Catherine said without looking up from her cooking. "Coffee's ready, and breakfast will be done in a few minutes." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. "You ladies didn't have to get up this early. Ranch work starts before sunrise, but there's no reason for you to keep the same schedule." "We're not here as guests," Mary replied firmly. "We're here to work, and that means we need to understand how this place operates. The only way to do that is to be part of it from the beginning." Elizabeth brought over a plate of food and set it in front of Thomas. "Besides, we're used to early mornings. Farm work doesn't wait for anyone to feel ready." As they ate breakfast together, Thomas outlined the day's priorities. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh grazing areas, several sections of fence required repair, and there were ongoing maintenance tasks around the barn and outbuildings. The sisters listened carefully, asking practical questions about the work and the layout of the ranch. "What about defensive preparations?" Catherine asked. "You mentioned that this Blackwood character might escalate his attacks. Shouldn't we be preparing for that possibility?" Thomas nodded approvingly. "You're right. After we finish the morning chores, I'll show you where I keep the weapons and start teaching you how to use them. I'll also show you the best defensive positions around the ranch in case we need them." The morning work went smoothly, with each sister adapting quickly to their assigned tasks. Thomas was impressed by their competence and their willingness to learn. They asked intelligent questions and took direction well, but they also showed initiative when they saw something that needed doing. Around midday, as Thomas was teaching Mary how to use a Winchester rifle behind the barn, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Thomas immediately motioned for silence and moved to where he could see the front of the ranch without being seen himself. 5 riders were approaching the house at a steady pace. Thomas recognized the lead rider as Jake Morrison, one of Blackwood's most trusted men. Morrison was a gunfighter with a reputation for violence, and his presence meant that Blackwood was sending a message. "Stay here and keep that rifle ready," Thomas whispered to Mary. "Catherine, Elizabeth, get to the house and keep low. If shooting starts, get to the root cellar and stay there." Thomas walked around to the front of the house, making sure his own pistol was easily accessible. As the riders approached, he stepped onto the porch and waited. The morning sun was behind him, which would make it harder for the riders to see him clearly, a small tactical advantage that might prove useful. Morrison and his men stopped about 20 feet from the porch. Their horses snorted and stamped nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Morrison himself was a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and a mustache that didn't quite hide the scar on his upper lip. His reputation as a killer was well earned, and Thomas knew that this confrontation could turn deadly very quickly. "Morning, Mackenzie," Morrison called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Mr. Blackwood sent us to check on you. He's heard you've got some new help around the place." "My hiring decisions are my own business, Morrison," Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Unless you've got official business here, I suggest you move along." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, we've got business, all right. You see, Mr. Blackwood is concerned about the type of people you're bringing onto his range. He's heard these new employees of yours might not be entirely respectable." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Morrison was trying to provoke him into doing something stupid, and Thomas couldn't afford to take the bait. "Like I said, my business is my own," Thomas repeated. "Now get off my land." "Actually," Morrison continued, "Mr. Blackwood thinks it might be better for everyone if these women moved on. He's willing to make it worth their while, say $100 each to find employment elsewhere." "The ladies aren't for sale, Morrison. Neither is my land, my cattle, or anything else you and Blackwood might want." Morrison's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Mackenzie, Mr. Deprave. Blackwood's been real patient with you, but his patience ain't unlimited. These women you've taken in, they're going to bring you nothing but trouble." Before Thomas could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway behind him. She had changed from her work dress into riding clothes, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who wasn't intimidated by threats. "Morrison," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. If Mr. Barry had. Blackwood has concerns about our presence here. Perhaps he should address them with us directly rather than sending his employees to threaten our employer." Morrison's eyes widened slightly at Catherine's directness. Most women in the territory wouldn't have spoken so boldly to a known gunfighter, and her composure clearly surprised him. "Ma'am," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness, "this really isn't your concern. This is business between men." "On the contrary," Catherine replied, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas, "this is very much our concern. We've made an agreement with Mr. Mackenzie, and we intend to honor it. If that creates problems for your employer, perhaps he should reconsider his approach to business relations." Mary appeared at the corner of the barn, still carrying the rifle Thomas had been teaching her to use. She didn't point it at anyone, but her grip on the weapon was confident, and Morrison definitely noticed her presence. Elizabeth emerged from the house carrying a shotgun, which she held with the same casual competence that suggested she knew how to use it. The three sisters had positioned themselves so that Morrison and his men were surrounded on three sides, a tactical deployment that couldn't be accidental. Morrison looked around at the situation he now found himself in, and Thomas could see uncertainty in the man's eyes. This wasn't the easy intimidation job he had expected. Instead of frightened women and a desperate rancher, he was facing people who were clearly prepared to defend themselves. "This isn't over, Mackenzie," Morrison said, pulling his horse's reins to turn around. "Mr. Blackwood's trying to be reasonable, but there are other ways to handle stubborn people." "Give Blackwood a message for me," Thomas called out as Morrison and his men began to ride away. "Tell him I'm not going anywhere, and neither are my friends. If he wants to escalate this situation, he'll find out that I'm not as alone as he thinks." Morrison didn't respond, but Thomas could see the anger in his posture as he and his men rode away toward Blackwood's ranch. Once the riders were out of sight, Thomas turned to face the three sisters. "That was well done, but it was also dangerous. Morrison's a killer, and now you've made yourselves targets along with me." "We were already targets the moment we agreed to help you," Catherine replied. "At least now we know what we're facing." Mary lowered her rifle and walked over to join them. "How long before they come back?" "Not long," Thomas admitted. "Morrison will report to Blackwood, and Blackwood will decide on his next move. We need to be ready for whatever that might be." That afternoon, Thomas took the sisters on a tour of the ranch's defensive positions. He showed them the root cellar, which could serve as a fallback position if the house became indefensible. He pointed out the best locations for rifle positions and explained how the natural terrain could be used to their advantage. The sisters listened carefully and asked practical questions about fields of fire, ammunition supplies, and communication signals. Thomas was impressed by their tactical thinking. These weren't helpless victims hoping to be rescued. They were partners preparing for a fight. As evening approached, Thomas gathered everyone in the kitchen to discuss their options. The reality of their situation was becoming clear, and they needed to make some hard decisions about what they were willing to risk. "We have 3 choices," Thomas explained. "First, you could leave and try to find safety somewhere else. I wouldn't blame you for making that choice, and I'd give you money and transportation to wherever you want to go." "What's the second choice?" Mary asked. "We could try to reach some kind of agreement with Blackwood, maybe sell him part of the ranch, or agree to some other compromise that would satisfy him." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "And the third choice?" "We stand and fight," Thomas said simply. "We defend this ranch and everything it represents, and we trust that right and determination can overcome greed and corruption." Catherine looked at her sisters, and once again they seemed to have one of their silent conversations. Finally, she spoke for all of them. "Mackenzie, we've been running from one bully or another for most of our lives. Our parents taught us that some things are worth fighting for, and that running away doesn't solve anything in the long run. We're staying, and we're fighting, even if it means we might not survive," Thomas asked quietly. "Especially then," Mary replied. "Because if we don't make a stand here, where will it end? How many more bullies will we have to run from?" That night, as Thomas made his evening rounds to check on the livestock and secure the ranch buildings, he felt a mixture of pride and fear. He was proud to be working alongside people with such courage and conviction, but he was also afraid of what their determination might cost them. In the distance, he could see lights from other ranches scattered across the valley. Some of those ranchers were probably honest people trying to make a living, just like he was, but he knew that some of them were already in Blackwood's pocket, either through fear or greed. When the real trouble started, Thomas couldn't count on help from his neighbors. As he walked back toward the house, Thomas saw Catherine sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars. He climbed the steps and sat down in the chair next to hers. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," Catherine replied without hesitation, "but I am thinking about what comes next. We've drawn our line in the sand, and now we have to be ready to defend it. Are you worried about your sisters? Mary and Elizabeth are both strong, but they're also young." Catherine smiled slightly. "You don't know them very well yet. Mary once faced down a rabid dog with nothing but a fence post, and Elizabeth has never backed down from anything in her life. If I'm worried about anyone, it's you." "Me? Why?" "Because you're carrying the weight of responsibility for all of us, and that's a heavy burden. You need to trust us to take care of ourselves, so you can focus on what you do best." Thomas nodded, understanding what she meant. For the first time since Sarah's death, he wasn't facing his problems alone. It was a strange feeling, but also a comforting one. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider arrived just after dawn with word that Blackwood had made an offer to buy out the remaining independent ranchers in the valley. But the offer was generous, but the message was clear: sell willingly or face the same problems that Thomas was experiencing. 3 ranchers had already accepted Blackwood's terms. 2 others were considering the offer seriously. That left Thomas and one other holdout, an elderly German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who owned a small spread about 10 miles to the east. Thomas realized that the situation was escalating beyond anything he had anticipated. Blackwood wasn't just trying to acquire his ranch anymore. The man was attempting to control the entire valley, which would give him enormous power over the local cattle trade and probably the railroad development that was coming to the region. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and Thomas knew that the real test of everyone's resolve was about to begin. The attack came on a moonless Thursday night, exactly 1 week after Morrison's visit to the ranch. Thomas had been expecting it, but the reality was still jarring when the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful silence of the Texas evening. Thomas rolled out of bed and grabbed his rifle, moving quickly toward the window that faced the barn. In the darkness, he could see the orange glow of flames beginning to spread along the roof of the structure. Dark figures moved between the outbuildings, and the sound of frightened cattle carried across the night air. 3 quick knocks on his door told him that the sisters were awake and ready. They had agreed on the signal system 2 days ago during their evening planning sessions. Thomas opened the door to find Catherine standing in the hallway, fully dressed and carrying a shotgun. "How many?" she whispered. "At least 6, maybe more," Thomas replied quietly. "They've set fire to the barn and they're trying to stampede the cattle." "Mary and Elizabeth?" "Already in position at the windows downstairs," Catherine reported. "We're ready." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for their preparation and competence. Over the past week, the sisters had transformed from refugees seeking shelter into genuine partners in defending the ranch. They had practiced their defensive positions, learned the layout of every building and fence line, and proven themselves capable with firearms. The sound of approaching horses told Thomas that the attackers were getting bolder. Through his window, he could see riders moving closer to the house, no longer trying to hide their presence. One of them was shouting orders, and Thomas recognized Jake Morrison's voice even at a distance. Thomas moved to the top of the stairs and called down softly, "Mary, Elizabeth, can you see the front approach?" "Yes," Mary's voice came back from the living room. 4 riders coming straight up the main path. 2 more circling toward the kitchen side. "Catherine and I will take the upstairs windows," Thomas decided. "You handle the front and side approaches, but don't shoot unless they start shooting first. We're still hoping they'll decide this isn't worth the cost." That hope lasted about 30 seconds. The sound of gunfire erupted from behind the house, and Thomas heard bullets striking the wooden walls. Morrison's men had given up any pretense of subtlety and were now conducting a full assault on the ranch. Thomas positioned himself at the bedroom window that gave him the best view of the barn area. The fire was spreading rapidly, and he could see at least 3 men silhouetted against the flames. He aimed carefully at the nearest figure and squeezed the trigger. The man fell backward and didn't get up again. From downstairs, he heard the sharp crack of Mary's rifle, followed immediately by the deeper boom of Elizabeth's shotgun. The sisters were holding their positions and returning fire with deadly accuracy. Catherine had taken position at the opposite bedroom window, covering the western approach to the house. Her rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and Thomas heard a man cry out in pain from somewhere in the darkness. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Morrison's men had expected to find a frightened rancher and 3 helpless women. Instead, they were facing coordinated defensive fire from people who had prepared well and were fighting for their home. The turning point came when Thomas spotted Morrison himself, trying to sneak around behind the house. Thomas called out a warning to Mary, who shifted her position to cover the back door. When Morrison appeared in her line of sight, Mary's rifle spoke once, and Morrison stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. With their leader wounded and having lost at least 2 men to the defensive fire, the remaining attackers began to withdraw. Thomas heard Morrison shouting for a retreat, his voice tight with pain and fury. Within minutes, the sound of galloping horses was fading into the distance. Thomas waited another 10 minutes before allowing anyone to leave their defensive positions. When he was satisfied that the attackers were really gone, he gathered everyone in the kitchen to assess the damage and plan their next moves. Elizabeth was wrapping a bandage around Mary's arm where a bullet had grazed her during the firefight. Mary was protesting that it was just a scratch, but she winced when Elizabeth tightened the cloth. "How's the barn?" Catherine asked, though they could all see the answer through the kitchen window. The entire structure was engulfed in flames, and there was no hope of saving it. "We'll lose the building, but the cattle are safe," Thomas reported. "Most of them scattered when the shooting started, but they'll come back. The important thing is that we all survived." "Morrison's wounded," Mary added with satisfaction. "I don't think it was fatal, but he won't be using his right arm for a while." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Good shooting, all of you. We proved that we can defend this place, but Blackwood isn't going to give up. If anything, this will make him more determined." "So what do we do now?" Elizabeth asked, still tending to her sister's wound. "Now we take the fight to him," Catherine said firmly. We've been reacting to his moves, but it's time to make some moves of our own. Thomas looked at her with interest. What do you have in mind? Information first, Catherine replied. We need to know more about Blackwood's operation. How many men does he have? Where are they based? What are his weaknesses? We can't win a straight fight against superior numbers, so we need to be smarter than he is. I agree, Thomas said. But gathering that information means taking risks. It means leaving the ranch and getting close to Blackwood's people. It also means we might have allies we don't know about yet, Mary pointed out. You said there's another rancher who hasn't sold out to Blackwood. Maybe it's time to talk to him. Elizabeth finished bandaging Mary's arm and looked up at the group. What about the law? Surely the territorial authorities wouldn't approve of Blackwood's methods. Thomas shook his head grimly. The local sheriff is either bought or intimidated. The territorial marshal is based in Austin, 3 days' ride from here, and Blackwood has friends in the territorial government. We're on our own. As dawn broke over the smoldering remains of the barn, Thomas surveyed the damage to his ranch and considered their options. The attack had failed, but it was clearly just the beginning of Blackwood's campaign. The man would escalate his efforts until he either got what he wanted or was stopped permanently. Later that morning, Thomas saddled his horse and rode to Klaus Weber's ranch to see if the old German was willing to form an alliance. He left the sisters to guard the ranch, with strict instructions to retreat to the root cellar if any more attackers appeared. Klaus Weber turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s who had immigrated to Texas after fighting in the European wars of the 1840s. His ranch was smaller than Thomas's, but it was well maintained and defensible. More importantly, Klaus had no illusions about what he was facing. Blackwood's men came to me yesterday, Klaus said, as he and Thomas sat on his porch drinking coffee and discussing their situation. They offered me twice what my land is worth, but they made it clear that refusal would have consequences. What did you tell them? Klaus smiled grimly. I told them that I had not survived 3 wars in Europe just to be intimidated by a cattle baron in Texas. I also told them that anyone who tried to force me off my land would find out what I learned about fighting during the siege of Vienna. Thomas liked the old man immediately. So you're willing to stand with us? More than willing, Klaus replied. I've been thinking about this problem since Blackwood started his campaign of intimidation. I believe we need to make him understand that his methods will cost him more than simply paying fair prices for land would cost. What do you have in mind? Klaus leaned forward, his eyes bright with the tactical thinking of an experienced soldier. Blackwood's strength comes from fear and from the advantages of wealth and political connections. But he also has weaknesses. His operation depends on supply lines, communication networks, and the cooperation of hired men who are loyal only as long as he can pay them well. Thomas began to understand what Klaus was suggesting. You want to disrupt his operation? Exactly. We cannot match his resources in a direct confrontation, but we can make his current strategy too expensive to maintain. If his men start getting hurt or captured every time they try to intimidate someone, if his supply convoys start being intercepted, if his communications get disrupted, he might decide that negotiation is cheaper than warfare. That afternoon, Thomas returned to his ranch with a detailed plan that Klaus had helped him develop. The sisters listened carefully as he outlined their new strategy, and he was pleased to see approval in their eyes. It's risky, Catherine admitted, but it's better than sitting here waiting for the next attack. When do we start? Tonight, Thomas replied. Blackwood's men will be expecting us to hide and recover from last night's attack. They won't expect us to go on the offensive so quickly. The first target was a supply convoy that Klaus had learned about through his contacts in Willowbrook. Blackwood was bringing in ammunition and supplies for his men, including several cases of dynamite that were supposedly for clearing stumps, but could just as easily be used for more violent purposes. Thomas and Catherine intercepted the convoy on the main road about 5 miles from Blackwood's ranch. The wagon was guarded by only 2 men who clearly weren't expecting trouble. When Thomas and Catherine appeared from behind rocks on either side of the road, both guards immediately raised their hands in surrender. Smart choice, Catherine said, keeping her rifle trained on the driver. Nobody needs to get hurt here. They tied up the guards, took their weapons, and drove the supply wagon to a hidden canyon that Klaus had suggested as a storage location. The ammunition and other supplies would be useful for their own defense, and the loss would send a clear message to Blackwood that his operations were no longer safe from interference. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas and the sisters conducted a series of similar operations. They intercepted another supply convoy, captured 3 of Blackwood's scouts who were watching their ranch, and sabotaged a water tank that Blackwood's men used when driving cattle across the southern part of the territory. Each operation was planned carefully to minimize risk and maximize impact. They never killed anyone unless absolutely necessary, but they made it clear that Blackwood's men were no longer operating in safe territory. The strategy worked better than Thomas had dared to hope. Word reached him through various sources that Blackwood was having trouble keeping men employed. Several of his hired guns had quit after their friends started disappearing during what should have been routine operations. The cost of maintaining his intimidation campaign was rising rapidly, while the benefits were becoming questionable. The final confrontation came 3 weeks after the barn burning, when Blackwood himself rode up to Thomas's ranch with only 2 bodyguards. The man was taking a huge personal risk by coming within rifle range of people who had proven themselves dangerous, but apparently he had decided that the situation required direct negotiation. Thomas met Blackwood in front of the house, with the sisters positioned at strategic points around the area. The cattle baron was a large man with graying hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the rough country of rural Texas. "Mackenzie," Blackwood began without preamble, "this has gone far enough. You've cost me more money and trouble than your land is worth. Then maybe you should have accepted my refusal to sell and moved on to other business," Thomas replied calmly. "I'm prepared to make you a final offer," Blackwood continued. $50,000 for your ranch, and safe passage out of the territory for you and your employees." Thomas almost laughed at the sum. It was more than his ranch was worth on the open market, but that wasn't the point anymore. "Blackwood, you still don't understand the situation," Thomas said. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about the principle that people should be able to live their lives without being bullied by anyone who thinks wealth gives them the right to take whatever they want." Blackwood's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Mackenzie. I have resources you can't imagine. I can make life very difficult for you and your friends." "You've already tried that," Catherine said, stepping into view with her rifle held casually but ready for use. "It didn't work out the way you expected." Mary appeared at the corner of the barn, also armed and alert. Elizabeth emerged from the house with a shotgun. All 3 sisters positioned themselves so that Blackwood and his men were surrounded. "You see, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas continued, "the thing you never understood is that some people can't be bought or intimidated. We're not going anywhere and we're not backing down. Every time you send men against us, it costs you money and reputation. Every time you try to expand your operations in this valley, you're going to face opposition." Blackwood looked around at the determined faces surrounding him and seemed to realize that further threats would be pointless. "This isn't over, Mackenzie." "Yes, it is," Thomas replied firmly. "You can accept that and move on to other business, or you can keep throwing money and men at a problem you can't solve. But either way, we're staying." Blackwood and his bodyguards rode away without another word, and Thomas never saw the man again. Within a month, word came through the local gossip network that Blackwood had sold his ranch to a railroad development company and moved to California to pursue other opportunities. 6 months later, Thomas received a letter from the territorial capital informing him that he had been appointed as the new sheriff of Copper Creek County. The previous sheriff had resigned under pressure after several investigations into his financial dealings with local business interests. Thomas found Catherine on the porch that evening, reading the letter by lamplight. "Are you going to accept?" she asked. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "It would mean I could help other people who find themselves in the same situation we were in. But it would also mean leaving the ranch more often and trusting other people to help run things here." Catherine smiled. "I think you should do it. Mary and Elizabeth and I have gotten pretty good at running a ranch operation, and besides, this territory needs lawmen who can't be bought or intimidated." Thomas looked out over his land where his cattle grazed peacefully in the evening light. The new barn was nearly finished, built with lumber purchased using money he had received from selling some of the supplies they had captured from Blackwood's convoys. His daughter Emma had returned from San Antonio the previous month, delighted to find that her father was no longer facing his problems alone. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "when I first approached you three in Willowbrook, I thought I was offering you protection and employment in exchange for help with the ranch work." "And now?" Catherine asked. "Now I realize that you were the ones protecting me. You gave me something more valuable than hired help. You gave me partners, people I could trust to stand with me when things got difficult." Catherine reached over and took his hand. "Thomas Mackenzie, I think we all got exactly what we needed from this arrangement. We found a home, and you found a family." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The desperate gamble of hiring 3 mysterious women had turned into the best decision he had ever made. Together they had faced down a powerful enemy, saved the ranch, and created something that none of them could have achieved alone. The next morning, Thomas wrote his letter accepting the appointment as sheriff. That afternoon, he asked Catherine to marry him, and she said yes. Mary and Elizabeth decided to stay on the ranch as partners in the operation, and within a year they had both married local men who understood that they were getting strong, independent wives who could handle any challenge that came their way. Years later, when people asked Thomas about his success as both a rancher and a lawman, he would always tell them the same thing. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that seem risky at first. And sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones most capable of providing help in return. The Donovan sisters had come to Texas running from trouble. In doing so, they had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire character of Copper Creek County. Their courage and determination became the foundation for a community where bullies couldn't prosper and honest people could build the lives they deserved. The ranch that Thomas had once feared losing became the center of a growing family and a symbol of what could be accomplished when people stood together against injustice. And every time he looked out over his land, Thomas remembered the night when 3 desperate women had agreed to take a chance on a rancher's bold move, changing all their lives forever.